podcast where we spill the tea on HITea. I'm thrilled to introduce Cat Middleton. She's a general partner at the Venture Collective. This is for our Fun Like a Girl series, so very excited to have Cat on. Thanks for joining us, Cat.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here today.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about your career journey that brought you into the Venture Collective.
I think if I just do it in chapters, I started my career as an operator and spent the brunt of it as a people leader. I think in the early days of company building, there's this kind of, environment that you're in, which is, limited time, but seemingly endless potential for all the things that you could do and achieve. And I think I saw a lot of my role was around focusing founders on the one or two most important things and then helping them resource against it. And so I did, for the better part of a decade, help build companies from seed to Series B. And then in 2015, entered the second chapter of my career, which was joining the partnership at Primary Ventures here in New York, which at the time was in its first fund and really kind of exclusively focused on an ecosystem that I'd say everybody somewhat overlooked and or more so thought of as a media and ad tech or even just broadly fintech ecosystem. Did that for the better part of 5 years, learned a lot. And I think coming out of that really came to kind of find my footing as an investor and came to understand what I wanted to be when I grew up. Right. Like, I think the reality is that in this industry, you don't know if you're a good investor for a very long time. And so at a bare minimum, I thought, what are the things that I care about in terms of spaces, in terms of types of founders I want to work with, in terms of geographies that I want to impact? And that really led me to TVC and my now partnership and the kind of 8-person investment team that we've built over the course of the last 4 years.
Wow. I mean, I can only imagine there are so many different spaces with so many different financial opportunities. So, what is your investment thesis? What do you typically like to invest in? And what do you look for when you're, trying to invest in terms of topics and the types of things you like to invest in?
Yeah, I mean, as a firm, we tend to be both wide and deep, I would say, which is kind of a, you know, tough thing to kind of understand, but let me kind of walk you through it. So, we believe that investing in mission-driven, impactful businesses doesn't have to be counter to generating outlier financial returns. So I think that's first and foremost like core to our thesis. The second part of it is how can we be investing in things that really impact people's day-to-day lives? So if you think about the everyday American and their inability to thrive, whether it is related to healthcare or finances or work, I think there are, despite all of the innovation that's happened and all of the money that's been invested in those spaces, there's still a lot to be desired, right? And in healthcare in particular, it's around how people access and afford healthcare, how they even just baseline understand healthcare. And that's an area that I like to invest in. Very deeply and have invested in a number of startups across digital health over the course of the last few years. But as a firm, we look at climate and sustainability. We look at human empowerment broadly, which is the intersection of a bunch of categories like fintech, ed tech, future work. And then life improvement is our healthcare vertical, which is both life sciences and digital health driven. I don't have a PhD, but I do have multiple folks on my team with PhDs. And so we're very well positioned to look at the more scientific side of things. Whereas I spend more of my time on the digital health side, which obviously in the last few years has taken quite a beating in terms of the amount of dollars that have been going into it over the course of especially the last few years.
Absolutely. So what size checks do you typically write, for folks looking to get investment into the innovations that they're creating in the digital health space?
Yeah, the short answer is it depends. The slightly longer answer is that we are deploying out of a soon to be $80 to $100 million fund. And we are fundraising and deploying as we speak. So as a pre-seed, I would say it's like 500 to $1.5 million. As a seed, maybe it's 750 to 2 million. And it really just depends on how much are you raising, what kind of ownership stake am I optimizing for, and what stage are you really, right? Because there's a pretty wide spectrum there of company, I'd say, maturity when you're talking about an idea on a napkin or something that maybe has some initial traction or is maybe even pre-Series A, but is a category that we really like. And so we try not to be overly prescriptive around it. We are a firm that only invests in roughly one company a month. And so there is a pretty high threshold for the things that we get excited about and ultimately get over the line.
That makes a ton of sense, especially if you're only doing once a month and you want it to be, really worth your time and effort and energy that you put in towards it. How does your personal experience with health inform your investment decisions? Do you have like an investment thesis that is based on experiences you've had or family has had? And is there a personal connection with the types of investments that you do?
Yeah, I'd say as an early stage investor, I'd be hard pressed to find any investor that doesn't draw from some of their personal experience when they make decisions, right? Because so much of this is how much do you understand of the broader space, but also what have you experienced personally, or have had happen in your kind of immediate networks. For me, having grown up in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, a large part of it was seeing how other healthcare systems work or not work.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
I was very privileged to grow up as an expat child and supported by Saudi Aramco, a very wealthy company that really kind of gave us access to what I would consider to be really best in class healthcare and for free. And so that was in my mindset, it was always kind of like healthcare should be available and accessible to everybody. And I knew that I was in an environment that was certainly not the norm because in the Philippines, it's a totally different environment. But then having come to the US, I think for as established and evolved a country as we are, it's very clear that even in the simplest things like how you choose a doctor, or in the maybe more complex things, which is how you navigate like a bill that arrives and understand the impact of having health insurance and not having health insurance. Like all of those things are actually incredibly difficult. And they're incredibly difficult for people like myself who have had very deep exposure to the space. And I would imagine very difficult for the person that hasn't. And so my view on it is that affording and accessing high quality care in this country is still wildly broken. And I think the view that I've taken from an investment standpoint is like, what can we be doing to bridge that gap? How can we be expediting people's ability to access and afford care and use venture dollars for positive good?
It does seem that investors can have a direct impact on the types of technologies that are being pushed forward, just because those are the technologies that are being invested in can survive enough to transform healthcare. What technologies specifically and innovations do you think will have the most impact on healthcare over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What do you hope that our children one day will be able to experience when it comes to care? Given a lot of the technologies that you're seeing and vetting every day and then investing in
Yeah,
as well.
I suppose like I'm not a scientist by trade, but I think there's a part of me that like hopes that the way in which we discover new drugs and cure diseases that quote unquote are not curable today. I mean, my hope is that all of the money being put into the life sciences space like really does move the needle on that side of things. And especially now that you have more robust set of people being included in clinical trials, like you'll have a much more um, a much higher likelihood of actually like solving that problem. And now that AI is being applied to the kind of biotech world, I think there's something to be said for that pace of innovation should be both faster and cheaper. So, but that is not in my direct wheelhouse. And so I think for me, aspirationally, it's the side of my firm that I think like I want to succeed the most because there are so many things that people deal with, chronic conditions that don't have cures or can't be managed well, that truly do need those innovations to happen. I'd say from like my perspective, the challenge I have with investing in digital health as a whole is that what you're up against is a really fragmented and archaic system, right? It is a system that is not connected. It is a system that is not digital or digitized in any kind of way. Or if it is, it's very piecemeal, right? And if you ask any individual if they have access to their full health record, I would say that most people would say that they don't, right?
Girl, don't even get me started on that. But keep
and
going.
so, and so I guess my point is like, how do you actually get to a point of truly personalized care if you don't even have the right infrastructure in place. And so, yes, I think there's a space for verticalized care as you've seen it come up, right? There are the Mavens, the Kind Bodies, the MIDI Health, everybody's kind of building for certain phases in people's lives or certain genders. And I do think that there is room for that, or maybe it's certain demographic areas, right? The thing is whether or not that actually does reduce cost of care and ultimately make people healthier in the long run, right? And you've seen care delivery is the largest percentage of digital health dollars in the world of venture, and there's a reason for that. But I think there's still a lot to be done to ensure that people actually, if you have some kind of ailment, get to that point where they feel like they're receiving that care, and over time that they're not a burden to the healthcare system. The other thing that I think is interesting is I have not known us to be the kind of country that is very proactive about our care. And so I think building trust, having the healthcare system be a place where people really trust will will inevitably get you to this place where you're either truly practicing like preventative care, or it's all just reactive, right? Which I think is actually a lot of our healthcare interactions today.
So true, so true. And I love this concept of like translational medicine going from bench to bedside and back. And this whole concept of maybe health tech funders and founders finding a way to bridge this gap between health tech and life sciences that's been typically fragmented and not connected. Because health tech, what they've done well is obviously clinical grade AI and, a fantastic focused healthcare specific NLP and other great technologies that are specific to health, right? And life sciences have done great things specific to research. So if we could somehow find a bridge between the two, perhaps care could become more predictive and research could become more accessible to all. What do you think about that concept of potentially, having those pharma potentially saving digital health and maybe digital health saving pharma?
I mean, I think there's certainly value in connectivity between the two. The reality is that they are like fundamentally two different spaces, right? And there's also like a very big difference for me between like kind of broader consumer health and then like really deep like life sciences and biotech. I think discovering new drugs is not a simple feat. And it's part of the reason why a lot of these companies tend to be more binary in nature, right? You either have an asset or you don't have an asset. I think the biggest challenge for me around healthcare as a whole is despite the proliferation of startups and companies that are out there that are for the benefit of the individual and this kind of notion that we want to make everybody healthier and have access to better care, the reality is like there's no real way to measure efficacy, right? So if you are at CVS and you are deciding between two different COVID tests, for instance, or two different supplements, there is virtually no way for you to understand which one of those to choose. And so often as a consumer, you end up choosing based on price or a personal recommendation, or provider guidance, right? Which is perfectly fair. But I think that if we want to get to a place where we truly will understand what is moving the needle and what is not, we have to find a way to truly figure out which of these are actually driving better clinical outcomes. And as a firm, we certainly look at what is the populations that this company might be looking to serve. But even a layer beyond that, it's what is the kind of initial clinical validation that if somebody were to adhere to whatever assumptions this company has, that they would actually be lesser of a burden on the healthcare system, that they would actually take their health more seriously or be more proactive about their health. And product choosing is like a very simple thing, right? But it is and it isn't. Like even in like if you were to go and get your DNA tested, how do you choose which company? Or have there are a lot of people who have been who have started companies around at-home tests. How do you choose? As a consumer, it's actually incredibly difficult to choose. There is no place where you go where these products are rated. And most of it is coming out of pocket on the consumer side, which is even more difficult because consumers already are pretty hard pressed for the dollars that they earn. And so if there is a more efficient path to guiding them towards purchasing decisions, I think that's like I mean, personally for me, that would be a huge help.
Absolutely. No, that makes a ton of sense. And I want to kind of go back to you talking about clinical validation. There have been studies that recently went out that investors generally see clinical validation as just as important almost as ROI when they're evaluating a company. What do you hope to hear from founders that you choose to invest in? And is clinical validation just as important as ROI? Or are you willing to kind of take a step with the hope that clinical validation can be figured out quickly once they have the cash in hand? Like, what is that process like? What do you hope to hear from your founders that reach out to you and convince you to invest?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that, well, I guess like it depends on what category you're building in. And so if I take mental health as a category, right? Because of COVID now, mental health and telehealth have kind of merged into one thing and has made it certainly more accessible for people to access care. I don't know that necessarily is that it solved all of the challenges on that front, but my expectation of a startup in the early days is that they probably still have a really low denominator of patients that they served. And so it's a bit hard to expect that data set to be truly pure and correct. And so I think you do have to anchor a lot of that knowledge around like the broader space and the clinical validation that others have proven through research, that telehealth does work, that people that engage in consistent mental health support are healthier down the line, that are less likely to be depressed, or at least are managing symptoms around depression or serious mental illness. But for the startup to have that firsthand data, it's pretty unlikely for them to have at least a critical mass of it, which would lead you to believe that everything that they're doing is kind of the quote unquote right thing, right? And so I guess like as an early stage investor, it's around like directionality. Is, do you believe the core offering that that company is bringing to market, does that enable that patient or that consumer to access care in a way that hopefully does make them less of a burden on the healthcare system as a whole? But I don't know that you have like real efficacy. Now, on the flip side, when we're talking about drugs, they have to go through multiple phases of clinical trials and like true like validation on that front. And so there are checks and balances, but there's an independent organization that is, creating those checks and balances. So I think it's a lot more rigid on that side of things. And frankly, if you told me that you had serviced 100 patients so far and you're seeing great results, the question I then have is like, is 100 patients enough? How did you choose those 100 patients? How much bias was included in selecting those first 100 patients? So I think it's less about like, what are the sweeping comments around clinical validation that a startup can make early on, but it's like really digging into the weeds of that. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, it does answer my question. That's very interesting. And, kind of on the topic of bias, how important do you think your role as an investor is into changing, shifting biases in the C-suite that have, and kind of shifting biases in technologies or making folks aware of biases even in things? And do you find that investors can have an impact on that? Like, do you find that you are encouraging companies or able to encourage companies to hire a more diverse leadership team, or really think thoroughly about bias and diversity in the studies they're doing or the types of research they're doing?
No, I think it is our job as investors to help. It's our job as investors to help founders, design their companies in a way that I think does have, or at least reflects the diversity of the population that they're looking to serve. Right? If you're building products for a certain subset of the population, that's one thing. But I think for the most part, like I do think that's partly our job. I mean, as a woman and as a person of color, I think it's very natural to my state to be thinking about the diversity of a team. And I think there's plenty of research that suggests that diverse teams outperform in the long run, no matter how you shape the numbers, right? And so, my team is majority underrepresented. Our portfolio has a nearly 90% underrepresented leadership team metric, and none of that is forced, right? All of that is just the fact that, like, we know it's important. It's a conversation that we have with our startups very actively. And I think that shaping the diversity of the tech ecosystem is an important part of changing who becomes successful and wealthy, if those companies are successful in the long run. And so, very front of mind for me. I think it's more that, like, I'd say it's a natural state of being more so than it is about forcing quotas on our startups, and it just feels it feels more authentic for us.
Absolutely. And I love that. Go cat and team, right? Go cat and team. So now I kind of want to dive into your personal life a little bit and kind of understand what is driving you and strategies that you use to kind of support keeping going in what you're doing. What are some things that you do to help work your best and make a difference? Are there hobbies you have or strategies that you have to just keep going and doing the work that you're doing? And this is, outside of work, just in your personal life.
That's funny. Trying to think if I actually have any real hobbies at this point. I'd say, I guess it's a few things. On the more professional side, it is around keeping a very good network of people around me that I can consistently lean on for advice or venting sessions or guidance. You can't really do this alone, and especially in an industry that's largely dominated by men, it does get very lonely and it can get very hard and tiring. And so I do think that, my level of involvement with organizations like Chief and Always, those are the things that I find incredibly meaningful. And those are the women that, help me push forward when days are hard. On the more personal side, over COVID, I started running in part because you couldn't go to the gym. And having had a newborn just 5 months ago, the regularity of my running is not the same anymore. But I do think there's something to be said to me about getting on a treadmill, not having my phone for 30 or 45 minutes and just completely zoning out. Because in this line of work, you're constantly engaging with people. And if you are an introvert by nature, which is what I am, like, it kind of draws out all of my energy versus actually gives me a lot of energy. I'm more than happy to talk and engage with people, but it doesn't, it is more taxing for me personally than it is like really giving me life. And having learned that about myself, I think finding that balance of being both outward and inward is really important.
I love that. People don't really think about what it's like to be an introverted leader, and what that experience is like when you're really needing to be on all the time and connecting all the time, especially when that network is so critical in what the work that you're doing. What are strategies you use to overcome challenges in your life? We all have hard things happen that just hit us like a brick. And what do you do when things like that happen to you to like help you keep going and keep just motivated to keep moving?
Yeah. I mean, I think at its core, when challenges happen and if you're looking to overcome them, the question is like, is it how worth it is it to you? Right? Like, how big is the problem and how significant is it really if you were to not solve it? Right? I feel like we've gotten into this mode as a society to be like, it kind of always feels like it's the end of the world these days. But for me, it's about taking a step back and saying, like, how much does this really matter? And does it really matter? And if it does, then like, what's the fastest path to me finding some kind of resolution or solution to this that I'm happy with? And sometimes, by the way, that is just reconciling with you're not going to get your way because you're just not going to get your way all the time. And so I think it is that is like the things that I'd say I do really well are I I act really I think I act really quickly, even with imperfect data points. And in this industry, you have imperfect data points all the time. And in life, you almost always have imperfect data points. But what I've come to realize is like not everything can and should affect you with the same gravity. And so, especially when truly there are people in this world that are struggling with things that are far more serious and difficult. And that's not to minimize the challenges that I have. There's certainly very real challenges that I've experienced over the course of both my personal and professional life. But it just puts things in perspective a little bit.
I love that. I do think folks really need to kind of have a perspective shift. When they're facing this huge obstacle, let me see how big this mountain is before I try to climb it, right? And then climb it, right? And I think that's a really great piece of advice. So thank you. Do you have any advice for women looking to become a funder, that are in healthcare, health IT, and they're thinking, I really want to fund in technologies that are saving lives. What do you wish somebody could have told your younger self, given your experience that you have now?
I think, well, to be a funder in general, I think the decision or the consideration you have to make is whether or not I think you have the energy for it, right? It is not an easy industry. It is not for the faint of heart. And, as an emerging manager, it's even, one step harder because you are both raising capital and then deploying that capital and building a name and a brand for both yourself and the firm that you're building up. And so I think, what I always say to people is that there's a lot about venture that you read about and that you watch, that is more glamorous than it actually is. And that's not to say that I don't love what I do. I do love what I do. I love being at the infancy of ideas. I love working with amazing, brilliant human beings. But this work is really hard. And this work is the kind of work where you are literally wrong 99% of the time. And so I think it's actually quite humbling to go down this path as an investor because you realize, especially at the earliest phases, that more often than not, you're going to be incorrect. And you just really need one or two amazing like companies to be winners in order to be quote unquote successful. But I think that like kind of changes the psychology of what it means to be in this kind of career, right? As far as it relates to healthcare, I'd say the one thing that I am a generalist investor. I don't just invest in healthcare. I do love investing in digital health because I think there are still so many things that we could be solving for the everyday American. But I think really truly understanding what our perspective of the world, how it interacts with traditional healthcare systems and the players that actually you need to have on your side in order to be successful, right? I think knowing the ins and outs of payers, understanding how health plans work, how hospital systems adopt technology, those are things that I learned by virtue of being in the space. But I think if there's a world where you can get some of that exposure firsthand before you kind of really jump in, it's why I think a lot of the best investors I've met have actually come from that world, right? Because they understand the bureaucracy that they're working with. So it's not just, do you have a cool innovation? Is it innovation that a payer or a provider is going to adopt? And at what pace would they adopt it? And so that's something that I think in retrospect, I wish I would have done a little bit more work in, but I do think that some of this is like you learn as you go. This is very much an apprenticeship business at the end of the day.
So brace for impact and know your stuff. Basically, I love that. Very interesting. So to finish off this conversation, right, where can our listeners find you online?
Well, I'm on all the regular channels, but I think if you want to engage with me, I am most active on LinkedIn. I am not so good at the Twitter X world. And then I'd say most VCs are actually pretty easy to find. They are just their first name at their firm.com. And so if there is a specific question that folks have, they can reach me there.
That's terrific. Now, before I forget, did you happen to bring tea with
I
you today?
did.
Tell me
I
about your
did.
tea or tell me about your mug. Do you have a story?
You know what? There's probably there's not that interesting of a story, but I am at I think as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm involved with a number of female focused organizations, one of those being Chief. And so I'm actually at the Chief Clubhouse today. And this is a place that I love coming to and working out of, because it is a place where I feel like truly you can feel the energy of other amazing, powerful women around you. And so, I guess my story around tea is just that I've chosen to record this in an environment that I think speaks to your audience. And I'm here having tea and coffee every day almost.
I love that. That's amazing that Chief does that. And women who are listening in, if you are a Chief member, don't forget that you can join in and have women supporting women from all different industries in one spot. How cool is that? Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kat.
Thanks, Grace. It was a pleasure to be here.
And thanks to you folks for joining too. Check out the HITea with Grace podcast website for more great interviews like Kat today. Cheers. Like a Girl Media is more than a media network. It's a community. We want to meet you and amplify your voice and the voices of outstanding women innovating in healthcare. Interested in starting your own podcast or hosting an event near you? Connect with us online or in person. We're here to support and empower you.